to the panel on successful European SaaS companies. We have a number of investors here who have been at the inception of an impressive number of those. So let me take a little bit of time to introduce them to you. On my full right is Norman Fiore. He founded Dawn Capital in 2007. And what's special about him is he started investing way before the dot-com boom and bubble. And so he's seen a lot of cycles pass, which is very relevant for his portfolio companies. He's invested in, amongst others, Colibra, Showpad, Mimecast, Gelato, and Automile. Next to him is Philippe Botteri, who is at Accel. He started investing in the Valley at Bessemer, involved in companies like Eloqua, Cornerstone On Demand, Criteo, wrote the book about SaaS, and then here in Europe has invested in Qubit, Algolia, and DocuSign, amongst others. And right next to me is Ophelia Brown, one of the partners at LocalGlobe, and before that at Index, went from later stage to earlier stage, and it has invested in companies like Typeform, Marvelab, Goodlord, and TravelPerk. So you can see we have a very impressive and very relevant panel here. And before we dive into how to spot, grow, and exit big SaaS companies, I kind of want to flip the tables a little bit with an audience of mostly entrepreneurs. You guys, all of us, have pretty cushy jobs as investors sitting behind our desks. Norman, what do you envy most when you look at entrepreneurs?
So I think envy is a dirty word because I might covet their equity positions. But what I admire about entrepreneurs is, unlike us, although we're on the risk scale doing the riskiest investments, we have a portfolio to fall back on. Entrepreneurs have one big bet and a fuse that's burning all the time. And if they do things really, really well, they get a slightly longer fuse. So it's a very intense environment, and to show poise, to show self-belief, to show bloody-mindedness in that kind of environment, I think is admirable.
Great. Ophelia, if you wouldn't be an investor, what would you do?
So I actually never thought I was going to be an investor. I always thought I was going to start a company. But my first idea, I actually got beaten to market. I was thinking about starting a peer-to-peer car sharing startup when I was back in business school. And it was a time when EasyCar announced that they raised £5 million with the car club. And I don't think they actually ever came to market. But I was talking to a friend of mine, Tarvet, at TransferWise at the time. And I said, Tarvet, the car club launched with £5 million of funding. What should I do? He was like, give up. There's no point. And so I thought, okay, well, this VC thing sounds kind of cool. So I'll try that for a while. So when I next have my idea, I'll know who else is working on it. But it turns out I actually love the investment side. So
that's great. And Philippe, being an investor is pretty great. But what does a bad day as an investor look like?
Well, the bad day is typically the Friday, because during the week you speak to a lot of companies, and at the end of the week you know you're not going to follow up with all of them, and so you have the list of companies that you need to email or call to tell them that, well, it's not going to be a fit for Accel at this point. And so, wait until the Friday, because you wait as long as you can to deliver the bad news. And then on Friday, you unfortunately have to deliver these messages, and doesn't make for a great day.
Thanks. So let's kind of jump into kind of spotting these SaaS companies with great potential. And all three of you have experience on both sides of the pond. Tell me, what is really different about SaaS companies in Europe versus in the US? Philippe, why don't you start?
Okay, so the big difference is that, of course, when you're in the US, you only have to worry about one thing, which is being successful in the US market. And if you want to be relevant in software, in most cases, you need to be a leader in the US. So you have this advantage of being right in your home market and just have to focus on that. The big challenge for a European company is to think about, well, first, Europe is a great place to build a great product because we have amazing engineers, amazing talent, and it's pretty cheap compared to the Valley in particular. So it's a great place to start, but then the question is, how do you address that US market? And when you're a team of 10 people, it just doesn't make sense to send 3 of them in New York or in San Francisco and have a team which is separated by 6 or 9 hours in time difference. So the challenge is to think about, well, how do you build in the early days this company while building a truly international culture? And one thing I've seen in companies that have been quite successful at doing it are companies that, regardless of their location, they just speak English in their office, and they have actually people from different nationalities, including people who are not speaking the language of the country. So if you're in Spain, you may hire people from Poland or from the UK who don't speak Spanish, and that really forces this international culture to set in the company. And once you have that, you can actually start to get customers in the US, even if you don't have a presence in the US. I mean, take a company like Algolia, for example. They managed to have 50% of their customers from the US without having anyone on the ground in the US. So when you start having this international culture and presence, then building your go-to-market in the US is obviously much easier.
I think on that point, the landscape has dramatically changed over the last decade, and to the point that you can be anywhere in the world and get customers from all over. So if you take the likes of Marvel or Typeform or Algolia, you don't have to be in Silicon Valley to go and get your first customers. I mean, you can find your customers through product evangelism. Like if you're top of product hunt, people are finding you. A lot of the early stage SaaS companies, they'll go self-serve instead of investing in a sales force. So I think just the times are changing in the way that you can acquire customers. And it kind of speaks to what we believe in as a fund, but you can start local and be global from the get-go.
Yeah. And Norman, if you kind of look at it, you look at early stage companies, and obviously it's important that the team is great, that the market is attractive, that the business model works, that you see early traction. What of those is most important, and kind of what do you look for in these elements?
Well, so we saw earlier today in the playbook that you want to build these great companies, great products, where customers leap into your funnel and swim down as fast as they can, and it's really great. So a lot of focus on cost to acquire. We like to focus also on cost to serve. We love businesses that have an inbuilt economic advantage, because ultimately there will be competitors with great products as well.
Yeah.
And if you can rip out a bit more money from every transaction relative to your competitors, it builds a sustainable business. Ultimately, nirvana is to have both phenomenal acquisition skills, but also, again, this inbuilt cost to serve advantage.
And Philippe, if you look at the kind of sectors in SaaS in Europe and the US, they're slightly different. Are there certain kind of subsectors you're really excited about, or others you kind of wouldn't really touch?
So it's true that when we published earlier this week our analysis of the top 100 SaaS companies in Europe, and we made a comparison to the top 300 SaaS companies, private SaaS companies in the US, and try to see what it meant in terms of sector. The part which was, so there were two main differences. One is that in Europe, you have a lot more, the proportion of SaaS companies doing marketing, providing marketing solutions is much higher than in the US. So it's nearly double.
And why do you think that is?
So I've thought about that and say, wow, is Europe really passionate about marketing? And I think the answer is that in marketing is a sector for SaaS where you have actually a lot of point solutions. Think A/B testing, for example, that's one point solution. Think about personalization, personalization engine, that's another point solution. And while in the US, in the market, you start having, 1 or 2, 3 A/B testing company, and then the fourth one say, well, there are already 3 or 4, I'm going to do something else. In Europe, the dynamic is different because people are just building their solution in their own country and say, well, there isn't any A/B testing company in France, so I'm going to build one. And then you have 2 and 3 and 4. And then in Germany, you have, we haven't seen any A/B testing company yet, so I'm going to build 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. And so that's why you end up having probably a lot more combined, but the challenge is that then these companies have a lot of trouble expanding because the US is already a competitive market, and then getting to another country is very challenging because they have 3 or 4 local champions already.
Yeah, and Norman, what sectors are you excited about?
So we're looking for global category leaders. So we're not sector specific in our search. Our focus again is on looking for businesses that they have this cost advantage or whether they have an acquisition advantage.
Yeah. And SaaS obviously is very measurable, and there's very clear metrics that kind of, thanks to a lot of people in the audience, have pervaded across. But Ophelia, you tend to go really early in your investment, so there is something around the X factor and not just do the numbers add up. What is it you're looking for?
I think that in the early stage, it's all about A, the team, and B, the idea. And I know that this means many things for many people, but if you're meeting 50 entrepreneurs a week, you can really tell that wow factor when you walk into the room, whether it's that they're able to explain their idea to you in ways that you would never have thought about it, they have deep industry expertise, or the passion really resonates with you. There are just kind of multiple indicators that that's a team you want to back. And then, I mean, everyone says this, but it's so true. If you're not going after a big enough problem that needs solving, if the addressable market isn't huge enough that you believe that this market can sustain at least a multi-billion pound or dollar business, it's just too hard. So, team and market.
Yeah, that's clear. And what about sales model, Philippe? Are there special types of kind of customer bases you like more than others? You kind of like companies going relatively big to smaller, or kind of come from the lower end of the market?
Well, I mean, I think what's interesting if you look at SaaS is that there have been great stories at all ends of the spectrum. So on one side you have Wix that has been selling to small businesses, or Shopify, and these are billion-dollar companies. And then on the other end you have most of the company who are starting in the mid-market and then moving up segment as their product mature and they're able to go up. I mean, if you think about Salesforce when they started in early 2000, their first year was all about, well, we're CRM for small businesses, and now you speak to Salesforce and they only care about the enterprise and the 7-figure deals. So I think that's the beauty on SaaS, is that you can do both. Now, the challenge is that if you are on the smaller end, that's where the issue is that the churn is typically high. So when the churn is high, and that's intrinsic of the market, so there is not much you can do about it, there are 2 things that are very important. Is one, you need to make sure that the universe of leads is very, very large, because as you have a leaking bucket, and as you grow, that leak every year is getting bigger and bigger. So you need to make sure that the pond that you're fishing into is super wide. I mean, if you look at Wix, it's like every company in the world, every small business needs a website. So you're like, wow, that's millions and millions of companies. So even if I'm leaking, I know I can go and get new one. And then the second thing is make sure that you can reach out to this company in a very cost-efficient way, because you need to have a model that is super high velocity, and where basically you recoup your cost very shortly because the churn is high.
And Ophelia, do you believe that there's a real change in how that sales model is operating?
I think we are seeing a shift, and I was actually going to jump in here. I mean, Slack arguably has no salespeople, but you can debate that offline. But I think that the way people are trying to sell their products, especially when design and kind of product is so important in terms of what you're selling, I think the traditional model is changing. No longer is it kind of steaks and red wine to sign those 7-figure contracts. I think it's much more deep in the product, explaining the benefits, and product evangelism is number 1 today. There was an interesting post by Jason Lenkin, which I recommend everyone read it, but he tries to understand the question of why SaaS companies find it hard to go beyond $20 million of ARR, and he points to NPS. I think that's really interesting, that if you forget about your product and your customer happiness, to Norman's point as well, you'll find it really challenging.
I wanted to add to Philippe's point on customers. So Mimecast serves the SME elements mostly. They're moved into corporate and have some enterprise customers. But there was a perception, a macho perception, that really to succeed, you had to be an enterprise. And somehow we were ashamed of our pedigree in SME. And so we built teams to attack enterprise when we actually had customers that were screaming for attention in our sector. So I would urge businesses to really understand who your customers are and not to somehow strive to attack enterprise as being a goal. It's also a graveyard.
Yeah. So maybe let's switch gears a little bit kind of to the growth phase of these companies. So you've kind of identified an early stage company, it's growing really well. What are the challenges to kind of to grow? And let's focus on two elements. First, kind of maybe on the funding side, especially in the current climate, and then secondly on what happens to people and culture. So Norman, maybe you want to kind of start on the funding side.
On the funding side, well, I think you'll hear it from all of us, which is, great businesses will always find funding. I think on the challenges side, and we talked about it a little bit before, is that a U.S. business, if you grow a U.S. business, the market is so deep that if you get product market fit, you're off to the races. Whereas a European business, you take the risk, you build product market fit, and then you have to take an existential risk to jump across to the US or to another country and then have that risk again. So that would be the main challenge for.
Do you always have to jump across, Philippe?
Well, you don't have to. I mean, I think there are two different models to be successful for a SaaS European company. I mean, there is the traditional model where at some point you need to be dominant in the US market, so you need to move across the pond and build your go-to-market there, and that's true if you're any enterprise software platform, like Algolia, or Qubit or PeopleDoc. I mean, all these companies where they're big buyer. The guys who are going to be interested in buying them are the IBM, Oracle, and Salesforce, and these guys are playing in the US, and you need to be present in the US. But then there is another category of companies that have emerged in Europe, which what I call is like the local champion. And usually, so these are SaaS companies that are typically playing into the strengths of a local market, and where there are some marketplace dynamics. So one example of that is a company like Doctolib, for example, which is selling a booking management platform for doctors. So it's a SaaS model because they sell to doctors, and it's $100 a month, and it's a recurring service. But then they have a portal for consumer where consumer go there to actually book their appointment. So you also have a marketplace angle which introduces a winner-takes-all dynamic. And the difference with this local champion is that their success means grabbing a significant market share in a market. And when I say significant, it's not 5 or 10%, but it's 50 to 70% market share, because you have this winner-takes-all dynamic. And then if you can do that in a couple of European countries, you can build a massive business, which is 100, 200 million ARR with a ton of profitability, because you have this winner-takes-all dynamics that makes the churn intrinsically very low. And at some point, when you have 70% market share, you don't need to invest in sales and marketing anymore, and then you can run the company with 50% EBITDA. So that's another model which has been emerging right now in Europe, which I found is quite interesting as well.
I think that's exactly true. I mean, from our perspective as a fund, we invest 70% of our fund in the UK market, and we have to believe that in the first instance that the market in the UK can hold a multi-billion-pound industry. So if you take multi-billion-pound business. If you take, for example, Goodlord, which is one of the businesses that we recently seeded, the rental market in the UK is £1 trillion. So if you become a leader in this business, you've got a very nice SaaS business. And I think that not only taking market share is important, but continuing to innovate and become a feature-rich product so that you don't have to worry about the number 2 or number 3.
Can I get back to growing pains? So when we talk to our portfolio CEOs, and we ask them, what should you have done differently? And this might be controversial. So cash clearly is key, and it's always burning away. So time is of the essence. So the entrepreneurs are very candid. Learning by doing is not necessarily a great technique in startups. There are some areas that actually you want to innovate, and you want to learn, and build new things. But there are some things that are actually sciences, sales and marketing, for example. And having your initial team learning their job and losing 6, 9, 12 months of performance is a big problem for some of these businesses.
And so that comes to hiring, and obviously one of the big hires everyone here is going to make or has made is your head of sales in the US. And it's notoriously difficult because good salespeople sell themselves really well. What can a European, maybe tech founder-led startup do to get a really great first head of sales in the US?
Well, so I mean, what you're saying is really true. I mean, if you look at the number one challenge for an enterprise SaaS company in Europe is building a successful go-to-market in the US. And most companies go through 1 or 2 VP sales and they lose 12 to 18 months before actually getting traction, if they do, because a lot of them actually never found that traction. And the reason is twofold. I mean, one reason is because they try to recreate in the US what they have done in Europe, and you will think that it's the same product, same type of company, so it should be similar. But actually, even if the product is similar, the way of positioning the product is actually different. The way to emphasize the benefit of the product is different. And one thing in the US is that in the US it's a lot more ROI-oriented sale, so you really need to show the bang for the bucks. And there is less of a problem of a budget that you have in Europe where companies say, well, you need to start in the budget. If you don't have the budget, you need to wait for next year. I think in the US, what I found is that if you can really show a very strong cash ROI on the investments, people will find the budget in some way. So that's the first challenge, which is really rethinking how you position the product, how you pitch the product to the customer. And then the second aspect is finding a good sales leader, and that's very challenging because first, if you're a good sales leader in the US, you'd rather go to a US company than a European company where you don't really know the team, you don't really know where they're coming from, you don't have the same way to assess them, you don't have a network that can tell you if the company is good or not good. So that's the first hurdle. The second hurdle, as Michiel described, is that these salespeople are very good at selling themselves, and so when people start, when European founders start interviewing VP sales in the US, like, wow, I met 10 people today, they were all great. And I think that's kind of a cultural difference where you need to go through, and the way to go through that is just be very specific when you interview the people about everything they say in their resume. Like every salespeople you're going to interview in the US has been a president's club, right? So you really need to understand, what does this mean in terms of, what is this president's club? Like, who got it? How many people in the company? What does this mean in terms of benefits? How many years did you have it? And really to drill down until kind of the bullshit goes away and you can really understand the performance of the person. Then the second advice I would give, which is obviously self-serving, but you need to have an investor on your board who is used to bring companies to the US, has this US culture, and therefore is also able to interview the candidate and give you his feedback as well. And I would say then the third thing is just do extensive references. Like I've been amazed to see like how few references people do when they hire people. And I've seen people that in some of our companies that were not performing well and gets hired by another company, and we don't even receive a single call on a reference call on these people. So pick your references. Like don't take the 3 people that the person recommend. Just go through your network, identify people that have worked with this person both under and above, and try to really reference them very well.
I think the other point to remember, just one point to add, is that your first salesperson, you want them to hit their targets. You want a salesperson, but that person isn't necessarily a good manager and the person to hire the team afterwards. And I think that's where it often falls down as well, because they can't build culture, be a leader, and be a great salesperson.
That's great. So let's jump to the exit side, which is also very important. There haven't been a lot of European IPOs, but we fortunately have you, Norman, here, who has been involved in one of them. Can you tell us a little bit about what are the challenges and also kind of what are the lessons from that?
Sure. So Mimecast today is a happy public company. But 3 or 4 years ago, we were looking at exploring options, and we were crossing the 100 million R number, so we thought, this is exciting, let's test the market. Now, Americans are phenomenal at self-marketing. we're a British business. And so the CEO had we're going to keep our heads down, build a big business, and then our numbers will yield fruit. Number one. Number two, because we were a European business, although we were a big business, we weren't a big US business. So actually our profile, combining these two together, was quite low. So we asked the banks to do a little test, and they ran around, and they came back and said, we can get you a good DCF price, but we can't get you a strategic multiple. And we're like, well, why not? We're a great business. Look at our numbers. It's like, well, it's very difficult for us to get you into a pitch, into a meeting with a buyer, and start off saying, let me introduce you to Mimecast, and then the conversation half an hour later saying, and we want the strategic multiple. So this not playing the game by the American rules actually hurt us a while back. Today, obviously, we learned our lesson.
And, the alternative, of course, is a very successful trade sale. Philippe, what would you think are the characteristics of gearing up for one of those?
Well, there are, I would say, two things that are very important. One is having a significant amount of revenue in the US, right? Because if you don't have any revenue in the US, the acquisition you're going to get is going to be just for your team and your product, and that's typically not worth much for the big software buyers, so the IBM and SAP and Oracle, etc. So the only way you get this strategic multiple is by having a significant market share in the US. So that's the first thing. Then the second thing is, acquisitions don't happen by chance because suddenly someone at in the corporate development team at HP say, oh, I've seen this European SaaS company, it's great, we should acquire it. Usually the way it works is you start by identifying way ahead, who are the potential buyer for this business? What are the set of the 4 or 5 companies where it would really make sense for you? And typically it makes sense because it's complementary to something that they already have. And if it's complementary, that means there's probably a partnership that you can do to start establishing, a joint, go-to-market, build some integration between the two products to make it stronger. So you need to start talking to the potential acquirer way in advance, start with a partnership. I mean, a lot of the acquisition I've seen started by actually a partnership, and at some point, the partnership is working really well, and someone in the corporate development say, oh, this partnership is working well, why don't we take everything for us and just buy the company? So you really need to think ahead of the curve on this, because you're talking, 2, 3, 4 years in advance to start building these relationships.
And Ophelia, I mean, we're all shooting for the stars, and we're here on the panel of the big successful ones, but obviously the reality is that a lot of companies do fairly well, but no more than that. Is there any kind of extra lessons for companies that, hope to get into 5th gear, but kind of end up in 3rd in thinking about exits?
I think that if you're thinking about exit, you're thinking about business in the wrong way. I mean, obviously, as Philippe says, these relationships take time to build, but in the first instance, you should be seeking these partnerships because you think it maximizes the future potential of your revenues in your company. So I think focus on product, focus on customers, and the rest will come.
Great. With that, we run out of time. I really want to thank the panel. Obviously, encourage all of you to grab them in the bar and ask 100 extra questions if you have them. Thank you.